How's it going there, ladies and gentlemen? Hailstone here again, and closing up the year, I was browsing through YouTube and I saw this video, and I knew that I had to make my own video on it. This video is entitled "The Uniforms of the Household Cavalry." It looks like it's going to be a pretty interesting video. It is by, I believe, Brandon F. So if you want to, go ahead and check out his channel, subscribe to him, and all the credit for this video goes to him. Yeah, I guess I'm just really excited to hop into this. The cavalry has always been an aspect of military that has always interested me, and especially looking at historical uses of the cavalry. I know that they're still around. There's, especially in the U.S. military, there are certainly cavalry units. They've begun taking different forms, obviously, especially post-World War I. They're not the same horseback riding soldiers as they've been throughout most of history, but they still, of course, play a very pivotal role in military operations. And so I guess in this video, we're going to be looking strictly at the uniforms, which should be a lot of fun. Obviously, the cavalry difference between U.S. and European styles is very different, both in terms of dress and appearance, as well somewhat as tactics, but I don't think we're going to get in that video. Without any further ado, let's hop into the video.
Now, this video was originally going to be just a very basic overview of the lifeguards as a whole. We were going to talk about their uniforms, their history, as well as their modern day practices. But reading through just their uniforms alone, I realized there is a great deal of material that I didn't really want to skip over any of it. And so rather than talking about just the uniforms of the lifeguards for a very short amount of time and then largely repeating a lot of this information in the next video on the Blues and Royals, let's just combine the two in one comprehensive video on the uniforms of the Household Cavalry. Now, the most immediate way to tell these two regiments apart would be their tunics, the Lifeguards wearing the bright scarlet tunics and the Blues and Royals wearing a dark blue, very appropriate to their name.
Okay, now I really should just pause right from the get-go. I'll say I have to tip my hat here to the British. Their military uniforms, I think, do tend to look better than our American military uniforms, perhaps with the exception of our Marine Corps uniforms. You guys do have us beat there. I do just have to point that out right at the beginning of the video.
Oftentimes above these tunics, we will see the cavalry wearing bright polished cuirasses. Originally from about 1661 until 1730, these cuirasses were just a very dark black, and there was no ceremonial purpose to them at all. They were only really worn in the field. Between 1730 and 1820, in fact, they didn't have cuirasses at all. With the polished cuirass, which we know nowadays, being introduced in 1821, it's remained largely unchanged since that time.
Now, those polished cuirasses, as far as I'm aware, the U.S. military has no equivalent of it. We don't wear them whatsoever, even for ceremonious roles. I might be wrong on that. If I am, somebody correct me, but I do believe we've never utilized those, as far as my knowledge goes, at least.
Moving on with armor, the Lifeguards have their very beautiful white plumed helmets with the strap being held underneath the lower lip, which, yes, that does sometimes cause...
I remember I reacted to a video some time ago where I noticed the chin straps on some of the headgear that British military wear, and I asked the question, like, why on earth are they wearing their chin straps underneath their lip rather than underneath their chins? And it looks awfully uncomfortable, as you could probably tell looking at the video of this soldier here. I suppose it does have its purpose, ceremonial and practical. At least when they were used practically, it was a practical use, but still pretty interesting to look at.
Complications. It's important to keep in mind that these straps aren't so much intended to actually hold the helmet on the head, but rather they're planned to deflect saber blows to the face. The Blues and Royals, on the other hand, have their red plumed helmets with the straps being held in a much more comfortable position, at least so it seems, underneath the chin. The current helmet design was introduced first in 1842 by Prince Albert to replace the old bearskin style helmets, which were used around 1830s. There have been minor changes to the plume and the spike in 1856 and 81 respectively, but otherwise the helmets are largely...
I really would love to go to that museum in real life, and I'm sure one day I will, and look at all the actual artifacts and see all that cool stuff and in person. It's a little bit different. I'd love to go there sometime.
Unchanged. Another small difference between the two regiments, the Lifeguards, you might notice, have a sort of bulbous onion-shaped top to their plume rather than the Blues and Royals, which have it loosely hanging down. This originates to the practice of the second lifeguards before the amalgamation of the first and second. We'll talk more about that in the history video coming up. And it comes from the way that second lifeguards would wash, tie off, and then dry the plume while cleaning it. Some more similarities: each regiment has their thigh-high riding jack boots made of leather, the design of which dates from 1812. Each regiment on their backs also carries a cartridge box, and these are from the days of black powder firearms, when the soldiers would be carrying carbines and pistols as well as their sabers. These boxes have remained more or less unchanged since 1856. Carrying those cartridge boxes, we have white cross belts, each with a red flask cord, which used to carry the powder flasks, again back when black powder was actually needed in the field. Now, the Blues had always worn these red cords, with the lifeguards adopting the flask cords in 1829. At first, the first lifeguards would wear red, and second lifeguards actually wore blue red cords, but when they were amalgamated in 1922, the regiment decided to stick with the red cords. Both regiments also have their plain white pantaloons. These are for ceremonial wear. Before 1812, there was actually a variety of colors, with the Blues and Royals actually wearing red at one point for their pantaloons, although after 1812 these were standardized, with both regiments wearing the rather smart-looking pure white. Both regiments, of course, have their thick white gauntlets and carry very ornate cavalry sabers, the designs of which have, of course, varied over the years, and officers tend to have, as usual, more fancy-looking ones, but more or less the design has remained rather standard. And at the very last, for the more colorful bits of this ceremonial kit, we have during the winter months, or otherwise just general adverse weather conditions, the lifeguards wear cloaks of bright red with blue collars and facings, with the Blues and Royals wearing, as you may have guessed, dark blue tunics with red facings. Moving, I should hope, rapidly onto the uniforms of the officers, we have their the same basic color scheme for their tunics, although their collars and cuffs are much more ornate with golden designs, as well as more decorative tails. Their crossbelts and slings as well are a bit more pretentious, beautiful looking with the golden color, and of course their most clear marker would be the golden shoulder cords on their breastplates.
Now, I should point out, obviously, you can tell very clearly the difference between American military uniform and even just in general European military uniform. It's far more decorative might not be the best word, far more elegant maybe is the right word. Our military uniforms tend to be very, very plain. There's not a lot of that, as you can see on your screen, in the way that we dress, and a lot of that I'm sure goes into the different histories that we've had on the two continents and how long we've been around as opposed to how long they've been around. But it is pretty interesting to note the differences there.
Other than, say, a bit more shiny metals or a bit of a fancier sword and things like that, normal officerial type things, their outfits are more or less similar to the uniforms of the troopers, with the same pantaloons and boots and all those sorts of things. But of course there are a number of uniforms outside of this, the most ceremonial, if you will, that they have. The first of which, we can begin with the undress uniform, which consists of a frock coat and overalls. They have small white gloves rather than the large gauntlets, Wellington riding boots rather than the much more uncomfortable looking jack boots, and a forage cap. The undress uniform is most commonly worn when inspecting troops under arms when they're in full dress. We also have the number 1 dress, which consists of a blue jacket with standing collar, Wellington boots, short white gloves, forage cap, as well as the cross belt with cartridge box. The officer's sword and shoulder cords may also be worn, and in the presence of a member of the royal family, the crossbelt and slings become gold rather than their regular white. We also have the number 2 dress, a service dress, which consists of the khaki brown jacket and tie, along with a white shirt, brown leather gloves, brown boots and trousers, as well as a brown, Sam Brown, belt. That meaning simply that the crossbelt and the waist belt are one and the same unit, if you will. A sword in a steel scabbard may also be worn. Besides these 3 alternate uniforms, if you will, there are of course a number of uniforms based on climate conditions and if they're training or in combat situations and what have you. We won't go into the detail of each and every single one of those, although you can find more information at the website linked down below. Lastly, we have the officer's mess dress, which consists of a mess jacket, waistcoat, overalls, and forage cap, with only minor variances between the 2 different regiments in cut and design, and these are really usually only worn during formal evening events, such as, say, dining at St. James's Palace.
So I should pause right there. The U.S. military, we also have our mess dress uniforms. Again, very, very rarely worn. I've seen it only a couple of times, and that is usually for formal military balls or things like that. And I think, I want to say I've only ever seen officers wear them. I believe that they are available for NCOs. Don't quote me on that because I could be wrong there. But it actually looks fairly similar to that. And the mess dress is probably our most elegant looking uniform. It has all the fancy bells and whistles, so to speak, that our regular uniforms don't have.
As for the enlisted men, the equivalent uniforms, they say number 1 dress, number 2 dress, things like that, are largely the same for the enlisted men and the non-commissioned officers. Just generally less decoration.
Also, I should point out that if the picture you're seeing on your screen is very blurry, that's not on my end. The actual picture on my video as well is also very blurry. It's just kind of a lower quality
when it comes
photo.
To things like the mess dress, not used nearly as much. Now, with that covering the basic discussion of the uniforms of the household cavalry as a whole, there are 2 much more distinct-looking uniforms which are still worthy of mentioning, these being of the farriers and the musicians of the regiments. But before we get into that, I would like to take a small aside and talk for a short bit about the horses themselves of the regiments. Now, from the earliest days of the 2 regiments, the horses were provided privately, generally by the men who would actually be riding them. And because of this, you might see a great variety of colors, of heights, and things like that on the field at any given time. We do know that by at least around 1692, the 2nd Life Guards were using specifically black horses, but again, the origins of that is very difficult to figure out exactly when or why that may have taken place. It's largely based around just paintings from the time period. The practice of individuals purchasing their own horses, though, would linger for quite some time, as even up until the Second World War, at least officers were required to actually purchase their own mounts. Nowadays, of course, all of the horses are directly purchased from the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, most of them coming from Ireland and being purchased around 3 or 4 years of age. They are selected by members of the Veterinary Corps and by the riding master, who is responsible for overseeing their training. The general requirements for the horses to be purchased are that they must be at least 16 hands tall, or about 5 foot 4 inches or thereabouts, and unbroken. The horses chosen for musicians do prove a few exceptions to this rule, but we'll cover that later. It takes about 8 to 10 months to train each horse, and about 16 weeks or so to train the rider. First, they do it in a full khaki uniform, and then in the proper ceremonial kit. Here we have a short video that I found at the Household Cavalry Museum over at Horse Guards in London about the training of the men and the horses. So I will leave you to that and talk with you again in the next, 2 minutes or so. Earlier on, I mentioned the farriers, and while we can talk more specifically about their actual role, about what they actually do in the future, suffice to say for now, they're a sort of combination blacksmith and vet, as they're responsible for shoeing the horses of the army. Now, each farrier, regardless of if they're a member of the Life Guards or the Blues and Royals, wear the same dark blue tunics, though the farrier of the Life Guards is always distinguishable because the plume on his helmet is actually black rather than white, with the Blues and Royals farriers getting the standard red. Farriers are always found bringing up the rear in any significant parade of the troops, and they are most infamous for carrying these large axes rather than the traditional sabers. Historically, I should say, these axes would have been used to dispatch wounded horses as well as to collect their hooves, which, again, we can talk more about why they would do that in future videos. Again, suffice to say for now, the hooves would carry information used to identify which horses had fallen in battle and such. In line with their role as the shoers of each regiment, their tunics also have very distinctive horseshoe insignias. And lastly, this brings us to the musicians, who, when compared to the troopers of either regiment, look dramatically different. This is, of course, mainly due to their brightly colored state coats. Now, these coats date back at the very latest to 1661 and have remained remarkably unchanged to this very day. Now, as you may be aware, going back to the 17th century, the relationship between Charles II and the Parliament was rather tedious at best, and while Parliament controlled the treasury, they refused to fund for the livery of the cavalry's musicians, so Charles II was actually forced to pay for the uniforms out of his own private funds, and the musicians were clad in the livery of the king. The state coats, as such, are bright golden and red colored, each one being decorated with the cipher of the current reigning monarch, currently, of course, being ER2 for Elizabeth Regina II, Queen Elizabeth II in Latin, and
Okay, so I imagine they would change now that it's King Charles. So would it just be CR? I'd have to look at that and see what the new uniforms look like.
And here you can see an old Victorian coat with a VR. I'm sure you can guess who that one's for. Other than this changing of the cipher between each generation, though, the coat has remained, again, remarkably unchanged over the past 350 years. The only real changes being to the standing collar and the shoulder wings. In addition to their very shiny state coats, the musicians wear jockey caps, which date much later to about the late 18th century. Their original shape was with a much larger and more rounded peak, with the modern design being introduced in 1881. Now, these lovely uniforms aside, if chance should have it that no member of royalty or the Mayor of London happens to be present for the occasion, the musicians often will revert to their non-state dress, recognizable as the standard uniforms from their original regiments. While there's not all that much to say about the instruments themselves, or at least not much that I could say about the topic, the two great big kettle drums are always a favorite. The horse which carries them must be particularly strong and well trained. Each one actually takes around a year and a half to fully train for the job. And each drum horse is actually a hearty Clydesdale cross. I don't actually know if they're hearty, but I don't know, they look rather hearty, I assume them to be. In any case, these horses often carry very heroic names, things such as Achilles and Hector, Alexander the Great, or Jimmy. And the drums themselves are often rather ornate and usually clad in rather royal coverings. Each of those drums is actually a total of 68 pounds, and when you combine the two of those with the weight of the rider and saddle as well, it seems rather obvious why just any old horse wouldn't do, adding the fact, of course, that they have to put up with a lot more noise than the regular horses, and no, they do not get cotton stuffed in their ears. Also of note might be the trumpeters of the regiment. Their instruments as well bear the royal coat of arms, and their horses, in very stark contrast to the rest of the household cavalry, are always a very pale gray. Trumpeters, of course, were the traditional means of communication between various cavalry regiments and their commands in the field, a role which they filled really up until the last days of cavalry actually being used on the battlefield. The trumpets themselves are valveless, and because of this, they're limited in the number of notes that they can actually play. They're usually used in fanfares for the monarchy. We always see them right before the singing of the national anthem, as well as during long guards over at Horse Guards Parade. Of course, the practice of using trumpeters to hearken the arrival of nobility or royalty date far earlier than just the reign of Charles II. Well, my goodness, I certainly did manage to drone on about uniforms for a lot longer than I certainly thought I would be able to. In any case, our next video will be about the history of the Life Guards, the 1st Regiment in the Household Cavalry. If you have any specific questions about the history of the Life Guards, or about their uniforms, about how they operate nowadays, and anything like that, be sure to ask, and I'll see if I can't include it in the next section, or otherwise just answer the question in the comments below, as I always do. And until that time comes, I am and I shall remain, dear viewer, your most humble and obedient of servants.
Alrighty, I think that's the end of the video, so let's talk about this for a moment. Alright, so I really enjoyed that video. It was a nice little thing. I wasn't planning on watching it or even making a video about it, but like I said, I was looking through YouTube and I saw it and I was like, hey, that's something I can make a video about. Obviously, uniforms, like I imagined, steeped in tradition and history, which is stuff that I absolutely love. It's the whole reason why I make reaction videos like this, is because of my love for history. Uniforms are really elegant, and I really appreciate that. And obviously, the British are well known for their decorum and their kind of flashy ability to make things look good. So that was a really, really good video. I enjoyed watching it. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as well. Don't forget, if you'd like to check out some of the other videos I do quite a few reaction videos to topics usually around history, particularly military history, so feel free to check that out if you'd like. Please like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton. I think that'll do it for now. You guys have a great day. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.